Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Halil, and thank you to Ibasi for hosting this book talk. A little bit belated book talk because book has been out now for about 2 years, though, as Halil mentioned, the paperback is newly out. So the book, as you can see from the cover here, is about the Islamic reform movement known as Wahhabism, which, as Halil described, is a controversial, puritanical version of Sunni Islam that emerged in the mid-18th century in the Arabian Peninsula and formed the basis for the Saudi state that grew up then. It's known today as the first Saudi state, and that formed sort of the progenitor of the modern Saudi kingdom that we. And ever since that time, in the 18th century, the Saudi dynasty, the Al Saud, have enjoyed a close relationship with Wahhabism and with the Wahhabi scholars. However, and as I'll come to at the end of this talk, that relationship is rapidly changing under the influence and power of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. So the book is intended to be something of a new history of the Wahhabi movement from its origins in the 1740s until about the 1930s, which is the period when, as I argue, the more radical tendencies in the Wahhabi doctrine were sort of reined in and attenuated by the founder of the modern Saudi kingdom. That version of Wahhabism during that period is something that I sometimes refer to as militant Wahhabism to distinguish it from the still intolerant, but by no means as intolerant and exclusivist and militant as the version that preceded it. So the book provides an extensive treatment of both the history of that movement, but also the doctrine, that is the theology, the religious thought underpinning the movement, which I trace, as Halil said, to these two 14th century scholars, Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. And I should add here that, before I get going, Wahhabism is probably one of the most, if not the most important of the early modern reform revivalist movements in Islam. However, it has not received the level of attention that one might expect from specialists and academic specialists who study Islam. There's a whole host of reasons one can look to for this, but in essence, what you see in a lot of the scholarship, with some exceptions, such as the work of Michael Cook and David Cummins, is a fair bit of tendentiousness, a tendency to engage in polemic, to either paint the founder of Wahhabism as some kind of saintly figure who restored Islam to its true and proper foundations, or on the other hand, a sinister, evil force who perverted Islam and basically ruined it for the 20th and 21st centuries. So you see a lot of that in the secondary literature, particularly after 9/11, which is when you saw a lot more academic and non-academic attention being paid to Wahhabism. So you had a book, for instance, published by Oxford University Press that tried to present the founder of Wahhabism as somebody who was fairly tolerant, who was even something of a feminist, as if that were part of his religious movement, that he was averse to jihad, things that really do not withstand historical scrutiny. Also in that book was the claim that Ibn Taymiyya did not have much of an influence on Ibn al-Wahhāb, and to the extent that he did, Ibn Taymiyya was much more radical. And in my opinion, it's quite the reverse. And then on the other hand, you had a whole host of pieces that were just kind of polemical against Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and against the Saudi state for endorsing Wahhabism. So with all that being said, before I get into the contributions of the book and what's new there, I thought I should start out by just going over some of the basics about what Wahhabism is, so we're all on the same page. So the founder of Wahhabism is a man named Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who is a religious preacher who was born in this region in central Arabia called Nejd. Nejd is an Arabic word that means upland, and it refers to this miles long, hundreds of miles long plateau extending east and west, surrounded on three sides by sandy deserts. But however, Wahhabism is not the product of the desert itself. Life in Nejd was dominated by oasis settlements. So Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was born here in al-Uyayna, which is a town where his family had been distinguished religious scholars. So he came from a family of religious scholars. He studies in Basra, al-Hassa or al-Ahsa, which is eastern Saudi Arabia. So Basra, al-Ahsa, and it's sometime, and in Medina. These are the three places where he kind of did his studies abroad. He belonged to the Hanbali madhab, which is one of the four schools of law in Sunni Islam. And Hanbalism was fairly marginal in the Islamic world at this time, but it was the predominant madhab in Nejd. And it was common for kind of upcoming religious scholars to pursue a course of study abroad, ideally in Damascus. He didn't get to Damascus for whatever reason, which is where you had some Hanbali luminaries, but in any event, he goes off and he comes back to Nejd sometime probably in the 1730s. He returns to this town here, Horeymala, which is where his father was the judge. And it is said in the sources, in the Wahhabi sources, that in 1741, following the death of his father, that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab launches what is referred to in the sources as a da'wah, a mission, a predication, a call for basically the revival of true Islam. And his call, as he presents it, is focused on basically two things above all. And these words in Arabic are tawheed and shirk. Tawheed meaning God's oneness or unity, sometimes translated as monotheism, and shirk, polytheism, associationism, associating other beings in the worship of God. And it was Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's contention that most of the world's professed Muslims were unfortunately engaged in acts of shirk. And that is because they were praying to saints, people who had been deemed righteous persons, who at their burial sites, at graves, at tombs, appealing for the dead, to the dead for help in this world, in a worldly matter, or for intercession, for their help with intercession with God on the day of judgment. Practices that were fairly mainstream to some extent in some places in the Islamic world still are, but for Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, these practices amounted to shirk. And what was required was the basically cessation of all those activities and the renewed focus on tawheed, which he understood as devoting all one's worship to God alone. So these practices at tomb sites are referred to in some of the scholarly literature as the cult of saints, and that's the term that I use. So Wahhabism begins in 1741 in this town of Horeymala. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab attracts a number of followers, but he's basically hounded out of there. Then he moves to al-Uyayna, and he's basically hounded out of there again, and he seeks refuge in this town here, Dir'iyya. Dir'iyya is the town where, since about 1727, you had the ruler Muhammad bin Saud, the founder of the Saudi dynasty. And Muhammad bin Saud comes to an agreement, an arrangement, an alliance with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, whereby they will support each other. Muhammad bin Saud will support Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in his religious mission, and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab will support Muhammad bin Saud in his politics. And this gives rise to what is known as the First Saudi State, which took a long, long time to develop. This is a part of the Arabian Peninsula that had not seen state formation since the 9th to 11th centuries. So very unusual for there to be basically a powerful state in this region, which is understandable given the limited range of resources that one had to draw upon here. There wasn't much to tax. There wasn't really all that much to eat or drink in this part of the Arabian Peninsula. Hard place to found a state. It's not like Baghdad or Damascus. But nonetheless, Muhammad bin Saud and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab were able to conquer neighboring towns in Nejd. So this is how it looks in about 1765. They're starting to conquer large parts of Nejd, but it's taking a really, really, really long time to get going. However, there comes a point in the 1760s and 70s where the expansion it opens up quite quickly, and by the 1790s, the Saudis, the first Saudi state, has conquered the east of the Arabian Peninsula, and in the early 1800s, in about 1805, they capture Mecca and Medina as well. And so this is what the first Saudi state looks like, as imagined by some Saudi cartographer, at least, in, say, the early 1800s. And it was at this time that the good old Ottomans, Ali's people, they decided that They had had enough of this Wahhabi menace, and they asked the head of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, Mehmet Ali, to launch an invasion to recapture Mecca and Medina in the name of the Ottomans. And ultimately, that campaign leads to a campaign to destroy the first Saudi state in its entirety. And that is what happens in 1818. The last ruler of the first Saudi state is brought to Cairo and then Constantinople, or Istanbul, where he is beheaded in a public square. And that was, so it seemed to many the end of Wahhabism, but it wasn't the end of Wahhabism, because that union between the Wahhabi clerics, their scholars, and the Al Saud dynasty is rekindled in 1823. You get a second Saudi state, not as successful, and I won't go into all the political details here, but basically it has a civil war at the end of the time of its existence. And then you have a third Saudi state that begins in 1902, when a man named Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman al Saud, the founder of the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia, he conquers Riyadh with a band of followers who are in Kuwait. They kill the governor there. They restart the relationship with the Wahhabis, and again you have a Saudi state formed in the Arabian Peninsula in the name of the version of Islam that had been first elaborated by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. So this is more or less kind of the outline. Nothing all that controversial that I have just kind of elaborated, maybe some additional details. But what's new in my book is that I try to give a new history of the movement from the 1740s to the 1930s on the basis of a great deal of new source material, and to do so kind of exhaustively, but also to look at the doctrinal components of Wahhabism in exquisite detail, and trying to tease out exactly what Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was preaching, what were the sources of the doctrine that he was preaching. And there I look in particular at the thought of Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. These were two 14th century Hanbali scholars who lived mostly in Damascus and were in their time quite controversial, in part for polemicizing against the cult of saints, much as Ibn Abdul Wahhab would do, though not quite as radically. And then I also look in the book at the relationship between Wahhabism and jihādism, or the ideology of al-Qāʿida and the Islamic State, ISIS, how similar or different those ideologies are. I think it's simplistic to say that Wahhabism was being exported by the Saudi state, ergo al-Qāʿida, and things like that. But I do believe that there are real kind of ideological parallels, and there are even appeals by the jihadis to this earlier period of Wahhabism. They see Wahhabi history as something to be admired and to be emulated. And they see Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and his teachings, to some extent at least, for many of these thinkers, as the backbone of jihadi ideology. So with that being said, I'll get into some of the more detailed sort of interventions that the book tries to make. And the first thing that I'll focus on is the source base that the book introduces. So as I said before, Wahhabism was a relatively neglected subfield of Islamic studies, but there was still a large number of sources that one could use. The most important, at least from the historian's standpoint, are the early chronicles of Wahhabism. So the earliest chronicle that we have was by a man from Eastern Arabia named Ibn Ghanam, who dies in about 1810. And he wrote his chronicle, which is called روضة الأفكار والأفهام لمرتاد حال الإمام وتعداد غزوات ذوي الإسلام, the garden of thoughts and reflections for the inquirer into the condition of the Imam. The Imam is Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and the enumeration of the raids of the Muslims, ذوي الإسلام. What's important to see in that title is that he uses this term, ذوي الإسلام, or Muslims, to refer to the Wahhabis. So the movement started by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab that comes to be to be embodied in the first Saudi state. In the depiction of Ibn Ghanam, those are the Muslims in his narrative, and all of their enemies are the unbelievers and the polytheists. So the way that history kind of unfolds in this chronicle, which is written in this kind of very stilted jargon, which is hard for even modern Arabs to read, the presentation is such that the Muslims are kind of presented as if they are the Muslims in the Sirah literature about the Prophet, in the early histories about the Prophet Muhammad and his followers and the conquests. The Wahhabis are kind of imitating that, or they're presented as the imitators, and their opponents are just like the polytheists who the Prophet Muhammad was opposed to and who was fighting. And so you get words like fath, conquest, being used for lands, for victories and the conquest of towns, and those who enter into the fold of Wahhabism and embrace the suzerainty of the Saudi state. That is called Islam. That is converting to Islam. And those who leave the fold of the Wahhabis and the Saudis, that's called ridda, or apostasy. So it's a fairly harsh presentation of history, which basically unfolds in here until about 1800. From then on, you have to follow the chronicle of the next great historian of the early Saudi dynasty, Ibn Bishr, who dies in 1873 and was writing considerably later. Still a very important chronicle, but basically these are two of the main sources that I draw on. Important to know that the historians, who we'll come back to because the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia today thinks that these people were unreliable, biased bigots who we shouldn't listen to anymore. They were religious scholars themselves. So they were not necessarily just historians. They were trained religious scholars. That was their field of study. The next main source that I look at in depth is the compendia of Wahhabi religious writings. There are a number of these compendia that were assembled in the early 20th century, the most important being Ad-Durar as-Saniyya, the Splendid Pearls, which was first published in the 1930s. But if you look at most of the studies of Wahhabism up to this point, this work is hardly cited whatsoever. There's a few other compendia that appeared in the early 20th century in Egypt. One thing to note that's different about my book too is that a lot of treatments of Wahhabi doctrine focus heavily on this one tome by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, which is called Kitab al-Tawheed, or the Book of Monotheism, which is something of like an encyclopedia of all the things that violate Tawheed. So you get chapters there on amulets and magic and all sorts of things. My approach is to look more at the epistles or the letters that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was writing, the way that he was preaching, and this is the way that he preached his doctrine and started his movement. It was done by epistles. Kitab al-Tawheed was really something to be studied in study circles, so not as important. If you look in here, you get a lot of those epistles. And then another source, which is quite important to my approach, concerns the refutations of Wahhabism, which is, for me, the most fun thing, because Wahhabism generated a great deal of hate, of spite, of many religious scholars from the 1740s until the 1750s and even later, who believed that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was a heretic, was somebody who was profoundly dangerous, even somebody who ought to be detained and executed. One person says, writing in the 1740s, and this is before the Saudi state had even been founded, that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab should be treated with medication for insanity because of the takfir, that is his engagement of excommunication. And if the medication for insanity doesn't work, then he should be killed to deter the likes of him, from being replicated, et cetera, and to stop his movement. But so we get a number of refutations that appear from Iraq to the Hijaz to Yemen, all around the same time in the 1740s. And there's one scholar in particular who I like to highlight. His name was Ali or Ahmed al-Qabbani, who was living in the 1740s in Basra. He writes one of the earliest refutations that we have. He's writing about, he says, and this is from the first refutation, Fasl al-Khitab, which exists in one surviving manuscript in a library in Baghdad, is dated by him in the end of 1742. He writes there that there arrived an epistle in Basra by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in mid-1742, And he goes on in the course of refuting Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and condemning him to reproduce the entirety of this epistle as he comments on it line by line. So if you look carefully then at the refutation, you can actually extract the embedded epistle. And because we have a timestamp on when this refutation was written, we know when we can assign it a terminus. Well, I'm forgetting the word in Latin, but in any event, the last possible date of that epistle's composition, terminus ad quem, is I think what it is. So we know, for instance, that the epistle that was being refuted here had to have been written in no later than mid-1742, which is quite helpful because without the aid of these refutations, it's quite difficult to put these kinds of timestamps on Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's literary career. So that's the first refutation that al-Qabbani wrote. He wrote two more, one which is called Kashf al-Hijab, which survives in a single manuscript, a Unicum manuscript in Hyderabad, India. This is his second refutation, which includes commentary on the same epistle, but an additional bit of material is added there. And then the third refutation that he wrote, which he finished in 1745, Naqd Qawaid Dalal, which refutes yet another epistle by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, that survives in Princeton. So you get in one single copy. So you have these three refutations written by a single scholar in Iraq that only survive in one copy in three different libraries spread around the world, which was a lot of fun to collect. I happened to be at Princeton doing my PhD work, so that was fun to look at. And it's this refutation is in al-Qabbani's own hand, the refuter himself, and it's his handwriting that appears on the front of the book, if anyone is curious about that. I went on way too long about that. The biography of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in his early career is something that I try to make a great deal of contribution to, in large part by looking at those refutations, piecing together the early history based on what is available, what we can learn from the refutations, and what is found in the early Wahhabi chronicles. It's just not to say that all of the condemnations and accusations against Ibn Abdul Wahhab are valid. I don't agree with all of them, not in the least. But they do tell you a lot about how the debate between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and his detractors was unfolding, and gives you a good sense of the timeline. And a lot of this early debate actually preceded the alliance with the Al Saud, which tells you that this movement in Najd was gaining steam well before the alliance with Saudi dynasty. So we see by focusing by taking that approach, just how central the issue of the cult of saints was. I mean, if you look at Kitab al-Tawheed, there were all sorts of things that bothered Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, but the prevalence of, the ubiquity of the cult of saints was what basically kept him up at night. This was the issue that animated him, that caused him to basically want to rebel against the institutions of Islam as they existed in his day. So for instance, he says in a couple of his epistles, the beliefs in righteous persons and others that most people profess today are shirk. Shirk is what has filled the earth, and people call it belief in righteous persons. That which is being performed in the Hijaz, Basra, Iraq, and Yemen, this is shirk. You get, in that early epistle that arrived in Basra, you get a very good sense of the kind of behaviors at these grave sites that are upsetting Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. So he describes them here by saying such and such a person intends to travel, so he goes to the grave of a prophet or someone else and comes to it with his wealth in order to avert robbery. And such a person is afflicted by hardship on land or on sea, so he appeals for help to Abdul Qadir or Shamsan or a prophet or a saint that he may relieve him of this hardship. So Abdul Qadir is Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, whose tomb is in Baghdad. So he is explicitly refuting the adherents of the Jilani order, but I think is it the Qadiri, order in Baghdad. And Shamsan is a local holy man who is dead in Najd, who has a tomb that a lot of people visit, and apparently they give offerings, votive offerings of their wealth in order to get things, favors from the dead saint in this world. And this is what Ibn Abdul Wahhab hates. But that's not the only thing he hates. In refuting in going after shirk of the cult of saints, he's also at pains to attack and to condemn the scholarly establishment around him, which in his opinion is overly concerned with Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh. And in his view, what has happened is that basically the institutions of Islamic education as they have come to exist are almost exclusively focused on fiqh, and in doing so, they have become slavish imitators of earlier authorities. And so this is the way he describes fiqh with reference to this Quranic verse. They have taken the rabbis and their monks, ahbarahum wa ruhbanahum, as lords apart from God, and the Messiah, Mary's son, and they were commanded to worship but one God. There is no God but he, glory be to him, above that they associate. This verse refers to the Christians who are being condemned for this behavior, but Ibn Abdul Wahhab applies it to the practitioners of fiqh in his day, saying the messenger of God and the imams after him understood it, that is this Quranic verse, as referring to this that you call fiqh, which is what God called shirk, and the taking of them as lords. So this is pretty radical stuff to be referring to jurisprudence as shirk, and earned him the condemnation, as one can imagine, of the entirety of the Najdi religious establishment, which was against him. And you can see in one of his very early epistles, he seemed to condemn the way that fiqh was being practiced, and he indicated that he believed everything in the most popular Hanbali legal manual that was in circulation at the time in Najd needed to be basically expurgated and reinterpreted in line with proper Islamic principles, which is, again, extremely radical position. And you get even more of this when he talks about his own teachers. So you'll have the kind of apologetic argument about Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is that all of this is being taken out of context. He's condemning shirk in the abstract. He's not really condemning, he's not really practicing takfir of anyone in the world. This is all misunderstanding. He never pronounced takfir on any Muslim. And you actually see that in Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's own writings. He says, we never pronounce takfir on a Muslim. We only pronounce takfir on unbelievers, which is, kind of a self-serving argument. But here is how Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab talks about his own teachers. And his own teachers, one has to understand, includes his own father, who was one of the leading Hanbali scholarly authorities of his time. I will tell you, and this comes from an epistle that he sends to the area of Riyadh in the early 1740s. I will tell you about myself, by God, apart from whom there is no God. I sought learning, and those who knew me believed that I had some. Yet I did not know the meaning of there is no God but God, nor did I know the religion of Islam before this blessing, had al-khayr, that God vouchsafed to me. Likewise, not one among my teachers knew it. If any of the scholars of al-Arid, which is a sub-area of Najd, claims that he knew the meaning of there is no God but God, or knew the meaning of Islam before this time, or maintains that any of his teachers knew it, he lies, fabricates, leads people astray, and falsely praises himself. So again, harsh stuff. I mean, you read Ibn Ghanem, you read these letters, the impression is this is a fairly radical movement, radical and it's in the context of the 18th century, and it was really trying to do something revolutionary, and that comes to be bound up in the first Saudi state, which I'll come to in a moment. The next kind of intervention that I make is when I examine the doctrine of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in some detail, and there I look at four key kind of categories of his doctrine. I think I call them I can't remember what I call them, but they're the four key basically planks of his doctrine: Tawheed, Takfir, al-Wala wal-Bara, and jihād. And I also look at how a lot of those ideas derive from the ideas of Ibn Taymiyya and Jawziyya, although I also argue Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab kind of deviates from that approach and takes those ideas in a more radical direction. So the first thing to notice is, just because there are some people who have argued that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was not influenced by Ibn Taymiyya in the slightest, it's important to recognize that the early discussion around all the refutations and the counter-refutations by Ibn Abdul Wahhab, a lot of it pertained to Ibn Taymiyya, and whether Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was correctly using Ibn Taymiyya, whether Ibn Taymiyya was a sinister figure in his own right. So al-Qabbani, who was a Shafi'i and a Sufi, writing in Basra in the 1740s, He did not like Ibn Taymiyya, not at all, because he saw Ibn Taymiyya as being against the cult of saints and having essentially been at odds with mainstream Sunni Islam. And he wrote in his earliest refutation, it is absolutely clear that you, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, have emulated Ibn Taymiyya in prohibiting, appealing for intercession to, and seeking the help of the dead and the absent. Intercession is shafa', seeking the help of is istighatha. It is absolutely clear that you have emulated Ibn Taymiyya and what the most distinguished scholars have counted among his faults and his fictions. You have followed him in this abominable doctrine of his that the scholars of Islam declared to be unspeakable. So for the Shafi'is in particular who were refuting him, the ghost of Ibn Taymiyya was being revived by Ibn Abdul Wahhab. And for the Hanbalis, however, and I can talk about this in more detail if one likes later, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was merely misusing Ibn Taymiyya. He had misunderstood him. But in any event, I proceed. So when it comes to the issue of Tawheed, which is really the centerpiece of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's doctrine, he uses this bifurcation of Tawheed into two kinds, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah and Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. The first can be translated as the monotheism of God's lordship, and the second can be translated as the monotheism of God's divinity or godness. It's not a very, they sound much better in Arabic. But in any event, this division of Tawheed into two kinds is something that was introduced by Ibn Taymiyya in his polemics, his 14th century polemics against all sorts of different characters who he viewed as not correctly following Islam, including those who worshipped at shrines. So the basic argument that he made is that there are these two kinds of Tawheed. The first, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, is very easy to satisfy. All that it means is that one acknowledges that God is the sole creator of the universe, the sustainer, the deliverer, etc. That there is one basically creator God. If one believes that, then one has confessed Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. But really, this is not all that of an achievement, because if you look carefully at the Quran, the Quraysh, the pagans against whom the Prophet Muhammad is polemicizing and who God against whom is polemicizing, they also confessed Tawheed al-Rububiyyah because they acknowledged that God in some verses was the one creator God. And in fact, when push came to shove, they at times would cling only to Allah as the one God and put aside their other gods. Where the pagan Quraysh went wrong was in failing to worship God alone, in assigning partners to God. And that is what involves Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah for Ibn Taymiyya means the worship of God as one, devoting all forms of worship to God as one. It's not about belief so much as it is about practice. So this is how Ibn Abdul Wahhab defines it, and he uses this in his epistles when he's trying to convince people about the shirk of the cult of saints. Tawheed is of two kinds, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah and Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. As for Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, it is what the unbelievers affirmed, that is, the unbelievers in the Quran, and were not Muslims thereby. It is the affirmation that God is the creator and the sustainer, the giver of life, the bringer of death, the arranger of all affairs. As for Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, it is directing worship in all its forms to God exclusively. So this, I argue, is more or less being faithfully used by Ibn Abdul Wahhab. He is not really altering any part of this doctrine. He's invoking it. He doesn't usually cite Ibn Taymiyya in doing this, but to anyone who was even somewhat familiar with Ibn Taymiyya's thought, it was very clear that these ideas come from Ibn Taymiyya, and that's what he is drawing upon. So Tawheed, the first thing, first big part of his doctrine. The next is that I identify as takfir, which sometimes translated as excommunication or hereticization, but really means more literally to declare someone to be an unbeliever, a kafir. And of course, in Sunni Islam, as in pretty much most versions of Islam, it is generally frowned upon to engage in takfir. There's a hadith to the effect that one who says, "Ya kafir" to his brother, well, the charge of takfir will redound on either one of them. So, be careful about takfir. But takfir was really at the heart of what Muhammad Abdul Wahhab was doing, because he was accusing the society in which he lived of being steeped in shirk, which basically meant, I'm doing takfir of you. And there are also places where he says that takfir is a duty. It's not just an implication. It is, in fact, a duty. However, Ibn Taymiyya was much more restrained in the practice of takfir, and he relied on these two principles known as al-'udhr bil-jahl and iqamat al-hujjah. So al-'udhr bil-jahl means excusing on the basis of ignorance, and iqamat al-hujjah means presenting or demonstrating the evidence, in this case, the scriptural proof. So what Ibn Taymiyyah, and these terms don't start with Ibn Taymiyyah, it's just he uses them in the context of talking about the cult of saints. So in some of his writings, he'll say that, well, the common folk, we shouldn't necessarily pronounce takfir on them because of al-'udhr bil-jahl, because they are ignorant. They are excused on the basis of their ignorance. And the evidence hasn't been presented to them yet. But once the evidence is presented to them, and it's been explained to them, well, then they have basically no excuse, no udhr left. And in fact, takfir is warranted. So he says in one place, this shirk, and he's talking about the cult of saints, if the proof of it is presented to him and he does not desist, then he must be killed. But if he is ignorant, knowledge not having reached him, and he does not know the truth about the shirk that was the basis upon which the Prophet fought the polytheists, then he is not to be judged an unbeliever, especially since this shirk has become widespread among those affiliated with Islam. But for Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the fact that shirk had become widespread was basically the reason why takfir was necessary. It was his view that the hujjah of iqamat al-hujjah had basically already it had already been established for everyone because the hujjah was the Quran, and anyone who had been exposed to the Quran was therefore liable to takfir. So as he says here, when it comes to the foundations of the religion that God clarifies and establishes it in his book, God's proof is the Quran. So anyone it has reached, the proof has reached. And there are many places where he also says that al-'udhr bil-jahl, no hindrance to jihad, to takfir. So you get a very different approach to takfir. I don't think Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was consciously departing from Ibn Taymiyyah, but in any event, if you look carefully at both of their writings, one is much more disposed to takfir than the other. And this is probably the most important, the most fundamental difference between the two thinkers, because if you basically open the floodgates of takfir, that means that you have to treat the people in your vicinity that you've accused of kufr as being polytheists, as being apostates. You have to alienate them, fight them, etc. The next plank of his doctrine is al-wala wal-bara, a term that's typically translated as association and dissociation, the duty of associating with Muslims and God, and the duty of dissociating from the unbelievers and what is apart from God. And this is something that you do find in the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and they argue that it's a feature of Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, and one who correctly worships God by doing Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah must also engage in al-wala wal-bara. Now, for Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the only part of this that really seemed to matter, insofar as his mission was concerned, was the negative aspect of al-wala wal-bara, and that is the demonstration of hatred and enmity to the unbelievers. So this is something that he was really fixated on. That was, in my opinion, perhaps the most overlooked aspect of his mission to date. So if you look at his writings and those of his successors, not only is takfir a main focus, often takfir is sort of just taken for granted. What is demanded of those who wish correctly to practice Islam is the demonstration of hatred and enmity. So as he says in these two quotes, Islam is not sound without showing enmity to the polytheists. If one does not show them enmity, then he is one of them, even if he has not committed it, i.e. shirk. A person's religion and Islam are not sound, even if he professes tawheed and eschews shirk, unless he shows enmity to the polytheists and openly professes enmity and hatred of them. He seems to be guided here a bit more by Ibn al-Qayyim. This is an argument that I make, who had made very similar comments to this effect, in which Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab cites. I had them in a different version, but that's not, in elaborating this duty of showing hatred and enmity, he appeals to two pieces of scriptural evidence in particular. One is this line in the Quran, which is about the Prophet Abraham, where he basically says, I'm going to separate from my people who have committed unbelief. You have had a good example in Abraham and those with him when they said to their people, we dissociate from you and that which you worship apart from God. We reject you. In between us and you, enmity and hatred, al-adawa wal-baghda, have shown themselves forever until you believe in God alone. And then, interestingly, in another piece of evidence that he routinely cites in elaborating this duty is the example of the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca. So the time before the Prophet had established a state and had strength in numbers. So there's this line that you find in the Sirah literature where the leaders of the Quraysh go to the Prophet's uncle, Abu Talib, who is the Prophet's protector, and they complain about the behavior of the Prophet Muhammad. They say, your nephew has reviled our gods, denounced our religion, derided our traditional values, and told us that our forefathers were misguided. And the way that Ibn Abdul Wahhab extracts a lesson from that is with this second line. A person's religion in Islam are not sound, even if he professes tawheed and eschews shirk, unless he shows enmity to the polytheists. So basically he says, the Prophet Muhammad wasn't just preaching, he was trying to alienate people. He was absolutely hell-bent on manifesting hatred and enmity to people and antagonizing those around him, regardless of the consequences. And that is basically the model for true Muslim behavior in the 18th century. That's his argument. Jihad is the next part of his doctrine that I maintain is very important, though it only begins to feature, of course, when the first Saudi state is founded. It's also the part of his doctrine that I think draws the least on the thought of Ibn Taymiyya. Ibn Taymiyya did have some interesting kind of contributions to jihad when it came to validating and justifying jihad against the Mongols in the 14th century. These were nominal Muslims, and there's some places where Ibn Abdul Wahhab refers to that fact. But for the most part, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's focus on jihad, or his understanding of jihad, seems to be different. He draws a validation for the idea that jihad can be waged against anyone who commits shirk, near or far, on the basis of Quran 8:39, where God says, and fight them till there is no fitna, that is shirk, and the religion is God's entirely. So that's what he says in a number of epistles, or refers to. So he understands the term fitna in this verse as meaning shirk, and therefore providing license for waging jihad against those for the purpose of eliminating shirk and instituting tawheed. So he says in one epistle here, we have prohibited them from committing shirk, and we are fighting them on account of it, as God says, and he cites the verse. And then there's another interesting way that he kind of combines the duties of showing hatred and enmity with the duty of fighting the alleged polytheists in jihad. So this is from one of his later epistles, where you can see and this is sort of the you could call high Wahhabism. This is the fullest expression of Wahhabism as it was elaborated by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in his epistles. One should know that if a believer is to follow the messenger, then incumbent on him are dissociating from this shirk, directing worship exclusively to God, rejecting it in those who commit it, condemning those who practice it, showing them hatred and enmity, and waging jihad against them until the religion becomes God's entirely. Again, a reference to 839. Okay, I should probably speed up a little bit so that we can get to Q&A, but I wanted to talk about these last two interventions briefly. The first has to do with the development of the first Saudi state. There are some who have basically made the claim that the first Saudi state was not necessarily motivated by Wahhabism, and that the early rulers of the Saudi state were somewhat like the modern day Saudi rulers. They're more secular, and they're using religion for their own personal gain. My own reading of the sources from this period is that the opposite is true, that they were in fact fervent believers in their mission, and not even that, and more so that they believed, or they hoped, that the first Saudi state was going to expand even farther than it was already in the early 1800s, even outside of the Arabian Peninsula, where it was beginning to launch raids in the 1810s into Iraq and Syria. And there's a really fun letter. There's a number of these letters that you can read. I cite them in the book from the third leader of the first Saudi state. His name is Saud bin Abdulaziz al Saud, who rules from 1803 to 1814. And he's writing in the context of an exchange with the Ottoman governor of Baghdad. The Ottoman governor of Baghdad is very upset because the Wahhabis had done a raid in, I think it was 1802, against Karbala in southern Iraq. and they had committed a massacre and destroyed the shrine there, the Shiite shrine. And this is the way that Saud talks about this episode. Your statement that we took Karbala, slaughtered its people, and took its property. Praise belongs to God, Lord of the worlds. We make no apology for this. We abase the unbelievers, shed their blood, and make booty of their property. We have no labor but jihad, no appetite save for the possessions of the unbelievers. We hope that God removes the shirk in your lands quickly, and that we eradicate the falsehood from it and establish the truth in it, God willing. I hope that you die upon your Christian religion and are among the pigs of hellfire, which is a fun line which actually has meaning, because this particular governor had been born, I believe, a Circassian Christian, and was brought up as a Mamluk slave soldier. And so he was in origin Christian, and this is actually the only way that I can sort of date this epistle and identify the governor. If you desire salvation and the safety of your realm, then I summon you to Islam. As the prophet said to Heraclius, king of the Romans, submit and you shall be safe. Eslim teslim, and God shall reward you twice over. But if you turn away, the sin of the husbandman shall be upon you. And here you have a reference to the prophet's letters, or alleged letters, that were written to the king of Byzantium and the Persian emperor in the 7th century, where he basically tells them, submit to Islam and you will be safe. Here you have the Wahhabi leader of the first Saudi state telling the Ottoman governor, in the language of the Prophet Muhammad, to the king of Byzantium, submit to Islam, convert, and you will be safe. Pretty stark stuff, and one of the reasons, I think, why the Ottomans and the Egyptians were so intent on basically eradicating this force. The last thing that I elaborate, it's basically the last third of the book, concerns the persistence of these ideas, particularly the insistence on the obligation of hatred and enmity among the several following generations of Wahhabi scholars, and the impact that this had on the succeeding Saudi states. So you had and a lot of these scholars, by the way, were the descendants of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who were known as the al-Sheikh, the family of the Sheikh. The most important of them in the second Saudi state was Abdurrahman bin Hassan al-Sheikh, who wrote in one epistle, God has made it a duty to dissociate from polytheism and polytheists, to reject them, to show them enmity and hatred, and to wage jihad against them. Hamad bin Atiq was even a bit more radical himself. He coined this term manifest enmity, which was the title of my dissertation, but Princeton wouldn't let me have as the title of this book. Unfortunately, they wanted it to be Wahhabism for understandable reasons, but his idea that he elaborated was that he distinguished actually between bughd, hatred, and adawa, enmity, where bughd for him was hatred within oneself. So I can hate Khalil without necessarily demonstrating my hatred, but if I were to do enmity, that would require demonstrating my hatred. So that's the difference. And he said that you have to have manifest hatred, manifest enmity for Islam to be fully demonstrated. So a man has not manifested his religion, Ibn Atiq writes, until he dissociates from the unbelievers who are in his midst and states plainly to them that they are unbelievers and that he is their enemy. If that has not happened, the religion has not been manifested. And his disciple, Sulaiman bin Sahman, would put a lot of these ideas into verse in many, many poems, manifesting this religion, is clearly pronouncing to them that they are unbelievers, for indeed they are an unbelieving people, and evident enmity and manifest hatred. This is manifesting the religion and proper condemnation. And I should explain that when the believers, or the unbelievers and the polytheists that they're referring to in these statements, what they actually have in mind are the people of, primarily the people who living in what was then the Ottoman Empire, the lands of Iraq, of Syria, of Eastern Arabia when it wasn't under Saudi control, and Egypt. And sometimes this would come out very clearly, where they refer to these lands as Bilad al-Kufr. And in the 1910s, Sulaiman bin Sahman and his allies would author a fatwa condemning the Ottoman Empire as Bilad Shirk, as lands of polytheism. The question was, should we support the Ottomans or the Allies in World War I? And the answer was, neither. But if we had to root for one to win, it would be the Christians, because they're worse in their unbelief than the apostates, who are the Ottomans. So that's a great deal of the book. Before I turn to MBS, I should say that the next part I explain sort of how these ideas are diluted, in the later 20th century. However, the relationship with Wahhabism is maintained by the Al Saud, even if the version of Wahhabism is not as militant and exclusivist as it was before. And then however, you get Mohammed bin Salman, who comes to power in 2017, and he has this whole new idea for how to relate the history of Saudi Arabia. And basically what he says is that we don't need to follow Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He is not Saudi Arabia. We have our own history. So he says the only problem at that time in the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th century was that the only people who know how to read and write are the students of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. So they wrote history according to how they view it. They wrote a Wahhabi version of history. And basically he says, I'm going to write a Saudi version of history. And this happens with the announcement of Founding Day in January 2022. So now every February there is a celebration of the founding of the first Saudi state, not in 1744 with the union between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud, but rather with the coming to power in 1727 of Muhammad bin Saud. And in the new version of 18th century Saudi history, there's basically no reference to Wahhabism whatsoever. Rather, the themes stressed are unity and security as against fragmentation, dissension, and instability. And with that, I will bring this to a close. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cole, for this very important intervention in the scholarship on Wahhabism. I'm just going to say a few words and then move on to the audience. So, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Sure. This is a very important work of archaeology, as you put it in your book. And like when I first came to the US in 2001, and after 9/11 happened, there was a very interesting piece, a news piece, and it was saying like there was a certain envoy going to Saudi Arabia, and like they were asking some Saudi people, like, so do you hate us? And then he answered, yes, I do theologically, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be friends with you. So I couldn't find that citation afterwards. Now, like when I searched it, but yeah, it was that kind of thing. So in the scholarship, as you put it, the European attitudes are very mixed. One thing that struck me was Muhammad Iqbal's like the construction of religious thought in Islam. In one of the chapters, there is some mention of Wahhabism and quoting MacDonald. So he says, the cleanest spot in the decadent world of Islam. It is really the first rub of life in modern Islam. So this is Iqbal approvingly quoting MacDonald. If you look at the Ottoman world, you have a lot of interesting views because, you know, like as coming from Turkey, when I encountered Wahhabism here, I found out, you know, they were calling themselves Sunni, but in Turkey, they are not considered Sunni, which is very interesting. So what would you want to say on that? But my real question is about the cross-pollinations between different versions of revival and reform. Like one thing that comes to mind is first, at the time of Rashid Rida, who was generously funded by Ibn Abdulaziz. You might remember that, like Martin Kramer quotes, you know, like he gave 200,000 pounds to Rashid Rida. But before that, we generally tend to separate, right? You know, the reformist and the revivalist traditions, like being more rational, philosophical of Afghani versus the revivalist, the purist one of him. And then like the second cross-pollination is when Muhammad Qutb goes to Saudi Arabia and Ikhwan becomes, Muslim Brotherhood becomes a thing in Saudi Arabia, and generation of activists and scholars, they got raised with that ideology, especially coming from Sayyid Qutb. So you said Sayyid Qutb in your book, there's just a mention of, a couple of mentions of Sayyid Qutb. But like don't take, like these as your lords. That part was very fundamental to Sayyid Qutb, as you know. Is there like anything more to that, when Sayyid Qutb covered some of the same issues and had the same kind of view of Islam in certain ways, in the sense that it is basically puritanical and purist. So the quietism, you didn't touch much on that. The quietism, you tell something on the book. So when they basically got off their horses and left jihad, it turned into a quietist theology, as you say. But then we also see, like in 1979, Juhayman al-Utaybi, and also jihadism that's coming now, like, which is very, very active and alive and well. So how is that like shift happened? And you might also, like, Ali is here, he might, like say better, but during the Ottoman times, of course, there was bad blood between Ottomans and them. But like there were a lot of books on them, like Hüseyin Kazım Kadri, Eyüp Sabri Pasha, Ahmet Cevdet Pasha, and they used to call them, like, not surprisingly, Khawarij and Ibadi. Yeah, so these are, my couple of words about that, and questions, if you want to. Yeah.
Thank you. Chew on the Khawarij claim is something that emerges quite early, of course. The Khawarijites are early Islamic sect associated with fear and spilling the blood of Muslims. So one of the al-Wahhāb basically endorses the First Islamic State, the violence of the First Islamic State. The accusations of the refuters start to change, and you get the charge of not just takfir, but of waging jihad, of fighting qitāl, those who are in fact Muslims. And because of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab basically approving of that, he was called a Khawarijite. So they're called the Khawarijites fairly often in the early literature. I should also mention, because I don't think I mentioned it, Wahhabism is not the term that Wahhabis like to use for their movement. They just, at least the original version, they would just say we're Islam, which of course makes it a difficult analytical term. You have to use terms, and the traditional term, even though it began as a term of abuse, is Wahhabism in scholarship. And in my own interactions with devout Wahhabis today, they don't really seem to be mind being called Wahhabis. There were some Wahhabis in the later 19th and early 20th centuries who kind of took the term on anyway. So in any event, that's one thing. Maybe I'll go in order though. So in Turkey, they're not considered Sunnis. I didn't know that. I'm sure that the feeling is mutual. But I once gave a talk on jihadism at a military college, and I had mentioned that ISIS was Sunni, and somebody stood up and said, "They're not Sunni. They're not even Muslims." I said, "Okay, I'm not taking sides. I'm just, this is the way that they approach the tradition themselves. They adhere to the tradition of the traditions of Sunnism. I regard them as Sunni." As for Rashid Ridda, so there's a part of the book where I talk about the relationship between Rashid Ridda, who was a Syrian-born, Egyptian-based reformer, a Muslim reformer, disciple of Muhammad Abdu, and he had a close relationship with, as you say, the founder of the modern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and gave him money. And Ridda was responsible for printing and editing a number of early Wahhabi texts. But what I found was that Ridda actually had a very tense relationship with some of the Wahhabi scholars, because they didn't like the way he was editing their texts, in some cases removing takfir. Sulayman bin Sahman in particular, the guy who wrote the poetry, he wrote a refutation of Rashid Ridda, which wasn't published for like another 100 years, which I talk about. And basically, a lot of the Wahhabi scholars saw Ridda and the reformers, this reformist school, as being philosophers, being not really Muslims, and kind of using King Abdulaziz for their own ends, and they didn't like it. But they didn't take too big of a fight over it because they knew that the king wanted to cultivate that relationship. But that there was a distinct difference between Wahhabism and Ridda. And Ridda, though he tried to present himself as adhering to Wahhabism, and by the way, he used the term Wahhabis in the title of one of his books. So he didn't seem to think the word Wahhabism was a bad thing. But there's a real difference there, even though Ridda tried to kind of clothe himself in Wahhabism. Muhammad Qutb, as you say, he came to Saudi Arabia at the first time, probably in the 1960s. Became a scholar at the University of Medina, taught many of the leaders of the movement that came to be known as the Sahwa. So he helped with this process, as I think you alluded to, of the mixing of Muslim Brotherhood ideology, the more radical Muslim Brotherhood ideology as elaborated by Sayyid Qutb and then his brother Muhammad Qutb. Sayyid Qutb was executed in 1966. That process happens really in the 1960s. So I would argue that it's really after Qutb's death when you get the merging. And at that time, Wahhabism is coming to be known in the Saudi version as Salafism, and the idea of Hakimiyya, which was very prominent in Sayyid Qutb, this idea of divine sovereignty and any taghut, any kind of tyrannical, usurping governing authority in the Muslim world, which doesn't rule by Islamic law, that infringes on Hakimiyya. This idea of Hakimiyya comes to be annexed to the idea of Tawheed al-Uluhiyya. And so among the versions of Tawheed, Tawheed al-Uluhiyya and Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, for a time you have Tawheed al-Hakimiyya. But later that just becomes merged with Tawheed al-Uluhiyya because it's seen as unorthodox. And why didn't I say more about it? Because the editor told me to cut myself off, kind of like you did today. So Juhayman, I talked very briefly about. I have a long article about Juhayman. This was the man who led the uprising in Mecca in 1979, 2-week seizure of the Grand Mosque. They were definitely motivated by, among other things, these originalist themes of Wahhabism, and you can find lots of references to Sulaiman bin Sahman and al-Wala wal-Bara, and the duty of showing hatred and enmity. And the jihadis are, in my opinion, even more kind of invested in cultivating this relationship with Wahhabism. They've clothed themselves in Wahhabi theology and history, and as a way of, I think, giving themselves legitimacy, but also looking perhaps genuinely for inspiration for a pre-modern Islamic revivalist movement, which was fairly radical and militant, but was not at all inspired or reflected by the West. And so I think it provides something for the jihadis that, if they want to be purists about faith, they can use.
How much we can do?
People not hearing.
Yeah, people are.
I'm sorry.
Just want to start off by saying thank you for your thorough research and history. It's probably the most thorough I've ever seen on this. So you talked a little bit about the Salafi movement, and obviously we're talking about the Wahhabi movement. The first part of this question is there a difference? If so, how do you differentiate between the two movements? The second part of the question is, it's clear that after World War I, there was colonial powers involved in the emergence of the current Saudi state. One, what is their role in propagating the contemporary Salafi movement or Wahhabi movement, whichever you call it? And two, what's the reason that this was not mentioned much, if at all, in your book?
That's a clarification. What is not mentioned?
The role of external powers outside of Saudi in propagating Salafism or Wahhabism, if they are the same. Yeah.
Sure. So the people here now, I don't hear anything. Okay. Wow, we really have. Great. So, Salafism versus Wahhabism. So there's a modern notion, the popular notion of Salafism in the Islamic world today, at least in the Arab world that I study, is a purist movement within Sunni Islam that appeals primarily to the theology of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. And so those ideas and that scholarly heritage are very much, at the fore of modern day Salafism. In Saudi Arabia, also heritage of the Wahhabis. So one way to look at it is that Wahhabism is a subset or a subsect of I think that's a fair way of categorizing it. The Salafis, of course, claim to be kind of appealing to the practices of the Salaf, the first 3 generations of Muslims, but there are, of course, many ways to do that. And they're very hadith-oriented, very scripturalist, but in terms of their theology, the way that they approach all of these sources, they're very much so indebted, in my opinion, to Taymiyya and Ibn Qayyim, and the more, let's say, radical to Ibn al-Wahhāb. Although you can certainly be a quietist Salafi who has a different interpretation of Ibn al-Wahhāb than the one that I presented today, that he was much more, that all the militancy was very much about context, and that a lot of it could be taken out of context quite easily. But I personally don't find that persuasive. When it comes to Western powers, so time of World War I, there were a number of competing sultanates and kingdoms in the Arabian Peninsula. You had somebody Imam Yahya in Yemen, you had someone in Oman, you had the Sharifs in the Hijaz, and you had in Najd and Eastern Arabia the Saudis. And the British were giving money to all of them because they wanted allies against the Ottomans. And all these people, as they saw it, were worth basically paying in order to be their allies. But the reason that the Saudis went out, I don't believe had very much to do with the fact that they were getting British, because they weren't getting more money than the others. In fact, the British were much, much more aligned with the Hashemites and the Hijaz. And they were against the Saudis going into the Hijaz in the first place. And then they rewarded the Hashemites with Iraq and Syria. So I don't believe that the Western powers then were responsible for either the victory of King Abdulaziz. The story I tell is, you're right, the West is not a principal character, particularly because if you read the Wahhabi literature from the time that I was talking about, the West isn't even mentioned. It's like the West doesn't exist. They occasionally, I think there's one reference in Ibn al-Wahhāb to Franks, where he seems to have some idea of Europe and the West, but his concern is definitely with the Islamic world. And this is a part of the Islamic world where even the Ottomans didn't really invest much capital. So the West was very much kind of far afield. And then when it comes to Salafism, the Saudis were for a long time at odds with the United States when it came to exporting this religious, which they certainly did, but not, I don't think, with the great approval of the United States. And for many decades, I don't think most American policymakers had any idea what were the differences in Wahhabism, Salafism, and Sufism.
Based on my question, I was wondering what Wahhāb said about Shia Muslims.
He loved them, as you can imagine. No, there's a line in one of his epistles. It's called, I think, Risala fi Rafida, an epistle on the rejectionists, the Rafida. That the Rafida, by which he really means the Shia, were the first to introduce shirk into Islam. So he saw them as unquestionably unbelievers, as polytheists, but it wasn't he basically retired, I want to say, by the 1770s. He stopped writing as much. So when it came to the conquest of Hassa in East, which is where there were a lot of Shia, he wasn't really around. He wasn't writing about that. So you don't see extensive polemics against the Shia in his own work, though you do in Ibn Ghanem, in that chronicle that I mentioned, the descriptions of the Shia as idol worshippers and the activities of the Saudi Wahhabis destroying their tombs and stuff. It's very harsh and very jihadi.
See Zakawi's blowing up
Yeah, and though I don't think Zarqawi referred to Wahhabism in that case, but when ISIS had a branch in Saudi Arabia beginning in about 2016, they staged a number of suicide bombings on Shiite mosques in Eastern Arabia, and some of the statements issued by their followers referred to Ibn Ghanem and referred to the more severe condemnations of the Shia in Wahhabi literature.
I couldn't use this. Thank you, Paul. It's great to have you. So I'm curious about this broader 18th century context beyond Arabia. Although it's not your major focus, but book is published. You might have read stuff, I don't know. But many issues Abdul Wahhab's he was interested in actually were kind of popular themes for a while, right? I mean, coffee, tawheed, Sufism, dancing. I mean, all major jihad, the nature of jihad and everything since 17th century onwards. People have been discussing those issues. That there are different positions, different movements. The Qadzadeli movement in the 17th century, as you know. So the way that I generally look at Wahhabism as an Ottoman historian, obviously, I try to situate Wahhabism and Abdul Wahhab in this larger Ottoman and trans-Ottoman context. I mean, recently I wrote something, even I said like Greek Revolution and the Wahhabi Revolution, I call it, should be understood in the in the same context, because both of them are really kind of radical rejections of the refutations of the Ottoman order. One is spiritual order, the other is political order, or both. So I wonder your take about how to move on in this literature. Your book and many others, and then the whole Georgetown School of the 18th century and Ahmed Dalal's book. Generally, the Ottoman context is not there. Like Ahmed Dalal's only mentioned, I think, 3 times, the Ottomans or something. It's not about the Ottomans, obviously. What is Ottoman is not very clear to me either. I'm not Ottoman. But other contexts of the region, the Balkans, Anatolia, Indian Ocean, Africa, and a kind of thinking a kind of larger, including actually Europe in many ways, although Europe is not mentioned, but similar themes, larger Naqshbandi networks of the 18th century, which is extremely influential. So I wonder where to go from now in this 18th century, this, if you like, reform movements. Thank you.
And
I think you might, reading between the lines, see in my book is it's kind of a monofocus on what response. Because there was a time when I think certain group of scholars were too casually clumping them all together. You had the Wahhabis and groups in India and Yemen, and there's Africa. Yeah, in Africa, and yeah, there's similar kind of revivalist, militant movements, and so there were kind of theories, most famously, I think, voiced by John Ball, in a number of essays, including one called "Linking Group Networks" or something like this, where he tried to show how there must have been like teacher-student relationships between some of these people. He tried to show that Muhammad al-Wahhab, because he had studied with a guy named Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi, who was kind of a deep-focused, somewhat of a reformer in Hijaz, that indicated a deep, profound influence in a larger, movement. But one thing that you get from reading Wahhabism, at least, is that the Wahhabis didn't think that they had any peers. With the exception of there was one guy in Yemen named Ibn, I'm forgetting his Ibn al-Amir as-San'ani, who in the later 18th century, I want to say 1750s, he wrote a poem praised Muhammad al-Wahhab. He was born, one of these guys was born as Zaidi, was effectively a kind of a Sunni with no madhab, and he was in favor of ijtihad as against taqlid, and he was also very critical of the cult of saints, and he was influenced by Ibn Taymiyya. And so there are a lot of similarities there with Wahhabism. Similarities, not, you know, so it's probably not a coincidence that you have a similarly kind of doctrinally constructed movement arriving in Yemen as you do in Central Arabia around the same period. I don't think anyone's been able to identify what the cause of that is, because what seems to link these disparate groups together, at least the ones that I think ought to be grouped together. There's also a movement in India called the Taymiyya Muhammadiyya, which also invokes the ideas of the two tawheeds and is against the cult of saints and for its idea of jihad against mushrikeen. And I think was perhaps inspired by Wahhabism, but I think Wahhabism was the inspiration for a lot of these. And then when it came to this scholar in Yemen who originally praised Muhammad al-Wahhab, he then, as I show in the book, he recanted his praise after being shown an epistle in which Muhammad al-Wahhab was endorsing jihad against those he accused of shirk, of kufr. So in Ahmed Dalal, in one of his articles, which I think is very good, an earlier article where he looks at the different revivalist movements at this period and tries to show how they all had their own differences. He kind of separates Wahhabism from all of them and says, Wahhabism is different because it was so militant. But I think he overlooks the doctrinal similarities that are still there. So I think Wahhabism took the Taymiyya to another level. And you can see perhaps the Qāʿida movement in Anatolia as even a precursor to all of these other movements, because there, and I've only kind of dipped into their works in Arabic, you see a reliance on Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, the pupil of Ibn Taymiyya, and elaborating their doctrine too. So where do people go from here? I don't know. I don't know Ottoman Turkish, and I'm not prepared to learn it right now. But I think that there needs to be, a more careful sort of comparison between these different movements. And there are many more too in Africa. And see, was there a common source of inspiration? Is there an explanation for the occurrence of these movements? Because one of the puzzling features of Wahhabism too is that there doesn't seem to be a more proximate scholarly influence on the founder of Wahhabism than Ibn Taymiyya, which leaves a gap of like 400, 500 years to fill in. So, what was going on with Ibn Taymiyya in that intervening period? It's a good question. Partly, I kind of turn away from the refutations as time progresses in the book, in part because the content of refutations is so repetitive. The same arguments, the same hadiths are brought to bear to condemn Wahhabism and to defend the cult of saints. But I think your point is correct that as scholars, as traditionally practiced, went on and in the major cosmopolitan centers of the world during this period. And one thing that I think needs to be understood, and part of what counts, I think, for like the paucity of studies, Western studies in particular, on Wahhabism during the earlier 20th century, is that before the founding of the modern Saudi kingdom and then the discovery of oil, Wahhabism was really not that big of a deal in the Islamic world, and it was widely seen as heretical. That's my understanding, my impression is that most people until the 1930s and 1940s, and for some time still thereafter, continued to see Wahhabism as Kharijism through and through. But there were attempts made by the king of Saudi Arabia to kind of broker an arrangement where the Wahhabi scholars would meet in congresses in the Hijaz with the leaders of different Muslim centers and countries. And so you would see, it's kind of funny to me that the same people who are condemning as Bilad al-Shirk, all of these lands just a couple of years ago are now sitting next to the leading Muslim representatives of those same countries in the Hijaz. So that's one of the ways there
the bridge is kind of closed. Though of course there's many people who still regard the Wahhabis um, as totally unbelievers. So the issue of takfir, and I apologize because I couldn't hear everything you were saying. Some of it's coming out of the microphone, some of it isn't. But you quoted something in Adura Siniya, right? That where Muhammad Abdul Wahhab basically he defends himself against the charge of engaging in kind of blanket takfir, right? Yeah. So what I point out in my discussion of takfir and on his practice of takfir, I bring out these cases where he does this, and there are a few, not maybe 3 or 4 that are kind of famous, and they're very famous. They've been made famous because the modern day Wahhabis like to highlight these instances where Muhammad Abdul Wahhab said, people are accusing me of doing takfir of Muslims, and this is not correct. I think that he is, frankly, I don't think that one can reconcile some of those statements with his other statements. Like when he's talking about, and he can be very clear. I mean, who he means are unbelievers. He's also, however, more ambiguous, I would argue, than some of his successors in the Wahhabi religious establishment, who are more kind of matter of fact about who is a kafir, that it is all people. So the view that I explained about al-udhr bil-jahl, about how it doesn't apply in the case of the cult of saints to anyone who has been exposed to the Quran. This becomes basically doctrine in Wahhabism after Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. And there are books about al-udhr bil-jahl and about takfir, where even the other statements by Ibn Abdul Wahhab are mentioned, but they're dismissed, because the idea is that he must have been saying that for a particular reason. I mean, that's the best explanation that I have too. So if one wants to paint, say, a less kind of exclusivist, picture of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, there are those quotes that we can look at where he says, "I don't do takfir." There are also, however, quotes where he says, people are accusing me of doing takfir of Muslims, and that's nonsense. I only do takfir of polytheists, which is like, as one of my friends has called it, it's a kind of a glib way of saying, yeah, of course you're already an unbeliever, so I'm not doing takfir of a Muslim, I'm doing takfir of an unbeliever. So that's one of the arguments that he made. Thought I had one more thing to say, but yeah, takfir, there's another line, I would say, in one of the early refutations where he's talking about the division that has emerged in Nejd between his followers and those who are against him. And he says, basically, this line is in the book, that takfir is mutual. We do takfir of them and they do takfir of us. And he never distinguishes between, say, the scholars and the laymen. That is just not something that one finds in his writing, to my recollection.